And the game award goes to Expedition 33.
Why are so many AAA developers leaving big studios to work on indie projects? Hey everyone, I hope you're well. Today I wanted to answer that very question I asked in the intro. Why are so many developers leaving studios like Naughty Dog, Activision, Blizzard, and Ubisoft in favor of working at smaller indie startups? It doesn't make a lot of sense, maybe on first glance, but once you dive into what I'm going to show you today, I think it'll make a lot more sense. So with that said, I'm going to jump right into it. And the first thing I want to show you is the Sandfall Interactive page. If you didn't know, the guy here, Guillaume Broche, is a famous Ubisoft dev. I forget the exact projects he worked on, but I'll put a list like somewhere on the screen here. He was the CEO and creative director of Expedition 33, which you saw in the intro, winning its Game of the Year award. That is a testament to what indie studios are capable of doing. That is an incredible feat, what they managed to do, winning 9 awards at the. It was just nuts. Like I'm at a loss for words to just describe. But that's not even the only thing we saw at the Game Awards from indie studios. I'm gonna go to a reveal that we saw, which was Highguard. Highguard is a free-to-play multiplayer game made by developers from Apex Legends, Titanfall, and I think Call of Duty to some extent. It was like former Activision employees as well, but primarily Titanfall and Apex Legends. Yeah, this is another indie startup made by developers who have AAA experience. So why are so many of these developers transitioning to working on smaller projects? So the first thing I want to show you as a reason for why so many developers are leaving the AAA industry is crunch culture. Now, I'm going to use Rockstar as an example, and this article here is a couple years old, but it should give you a pretty good example of how crunch culture works as a concept. Crunch culture is not only at Rockstar, it's definitely it's just a widespread issue across the gaming industry. Now at Rockstar, crunch culture was not just like we're at the end of the project, we just need to get this out the door kind of thing. This was usually a very prolonged issue over months or even years a lot of times. Employees have reported working around 55 to 60 hours a week, which is just insane. That's just beyond me. A lot of people felt pressured to work on like nights and weekends, even if it wasn't like officially called mandatory, but it was heavily encouraged by people higher up positions at the company. As development continued though, even directors like Dan and Sam Houser themselves made huge changes to what the people were working on, such as like redesigning core systems very late into the project. And with the deadlines fixed, they were kind of forced to just keep working because they didn't want to move the deadlines, and that's even something we're seeing a bit in the GTA 6 development today. At Rockstar, it became more of a culture of hours, not just output. The recurring theme that employees were mentioning was that there was an importance being placed on being seen at your desk during working hours without actually like meeting goals. Like you were just expected to be there sitting at your desk doing something productive instead of actually like making things happen. Rockstar reportedly looked down on those who left early or just didn't put any visible output into the projects. Some employees say they enjoyed working at Rockstar, saying the creative satisfaction made the long hours worthwhile. But others described having severe mental health and personal tolls, strained relationships, and burnouts with consistent overtime. And I'll talk a bit more about that as we continue through this, but we'll stay on the Rockstar topic for now. Many employees on salary did not even receive overtime pay, so they were working all these extra hours, but they weren't being compensated for that time. And then the bonuses tied to the game's success were just like a part of the compensation. Like they would say, oh, we're going to give you these if the game is successful. If you guys make a good game, you're going to get these. Now, in Red Dead's sake, they made a very good game, but also if they didn't make a good game, then they were going to have put in all those hours without actually seeing any payment. Rockstar's leadership did acknowledge that long hours happened, but they still deny that the crunch was like forced or whatever. Rockstar management did highlight that reported weekly averages were way lower than many anecdotes suggested. Whether that's credible information or not is up to you, or you can read through this Kotaku article on your own. I'll leave the link to that in the description. But many employees were very afraid to speak out openly about this due to fear of retaliation or negative career consequences. I understand why. I mean, you go out and you speak negatively about the company you're working for, they're not going to be a huge fan of that. Whether they intended to force it on you, there was still this surrounding culture of fear that made it a little bit sketchy to say no to the higher ups who wanted you to be at your desk working. Now, in recent days, there have been some improvements to how crunch culture is handled at the company, especially compared to early projects, but leadership has suggested that the newer generation of employees with stronger expectations for work-life balance did like really force the shift in the culture. So that article kind of just summarized what crunch culture was like in a game studio, but what are the actual effects of crunch because everybody has to do hard work sometimes, even if it's not fun. In this article from Game Developer written by Joseph Knoop, he's going to be talking about exactly that. He starts out in the article here, I'll scroll down a bit so you can see what I'm looking at here. He's interviewing a guy named Schreiber, and Schreiber emphasizes that humans do not produce a consistent amount of output regardless of hours worked. So instead of that, productivity peaks at modest work hours and declines after that. You actually are more productive when you are working around 25 hours per week within the creative field. You kind of peak at around the 24-hour point. Creative output decreases as fatigue sets in throughout the week. Extended crunch results in progressive productivity loss, like just overtime. So if you're in a crunch season for months on end, it's going to see a lot of negative consequences. The extended periods of crunch can actually result in the output becoming negative, and the amount of work that's actually being put towards the project is counterintuitive. It's just not helping the thing move along. So even if workers do take a weekend or an extended weekend, the performance can still take quite a while to return to normal after a very prolonged season of crunch. And it doesn't just stop at the performance impacts. It goes as far as to dive into physical health impacts as well. Crunch doesn't actually just make people tired. It can lead to like serious biochemical changes, like similar to the effects of intoxication, like impaired judgment and slower reaction times. That is the effect of being like within a prolonged season of crunch. Now, the chronic stress from that can also set in and alter your blood chemistry. So your cortisol, glucose, and cholesterol hormones is all linked to like increased risk for ulcers, heart problems, strokes, and other medical conditions. But yeah, there's also mood changes like heightened anger and hostility, and can increase workplace conflicts. So not only is the teamwork impaired, your actual like mind space is impaired by the overworked crunch culture. And working hours that long usually means that you'll have to sleep quite a bit less. And research is showing that those who are working 55 hours a week or more are much more likely to have shortened sleep, difficulty falling asleep, and feeling like when you wake up feeling unrefreshed, compared to people working a standard 35 to 40 hours a week. Schreiber also points out that the lack of sleep mirrors the effects of drunkenness, so not only from the effects of overworking, but you're also exhausted, impairing even more motor skills, judgment, and thought processes. To make matters worse, there is absolutely no correlation between crunch time and like better game output. No matter how much overtime is pushed, the game itself is not actually going to be any better because of those extra hours worked. Oftentimes when people are tired, they go to caffeine as a solution to kind of just, cope with the effects of sleeplessness. But it only brings performance back to a baseline level rather than giving it an actual performance boost. And caffeine is still a drug, not a thing you want to fall back on you don't want to be reliant on it, is what I'm saying. Because even getting off caffeine can have withdrawal symptoms and everything that you would experience if you just got off heroin. So in terms of suggested solutions to like even fix this problem, they need to work on basic wellness practices and just better project scope management. Having the alternatives, they just need to have alternatives to extended periods of crunch and just overworking people in general. The key takeaway, though, from this article is that extended crunch is scientifically unsupported as a productivity booster, and working prolonged overtime can actually lead to declining performance, real physiological stress, health risks, impaired judgment, and longer recovery times. It's just not a good environment for someone to be in. But going back to Clair Obscur briefly, and I'll even mention some other indie games. Think of like Silksong, Hades 2, even go back a couple years to Baldur's Gate 3. All these games are just incredible games. All three of the first games I mentioned, like from this year, were Game of the Year nominations, and BG3 won Game of the Year a couple years ago. The thing that all these games have in common is that there is not a decline in quality. If you look at a Ubisoft project recently, do you remember the Assassin's Creed Shadows expansion? The one that had the significant like varying quality to it? That kind of thing doesn't happen in indie studios. Even if I go back a couple more years and think of Cyberpunk's launch. Now, Cyberpunk's launch wasn't only because of corporate pressure, but also some governmental pressure. That's a crazy story if you want to look into that. But they had to fix it after launch, which is another issue that a lot of AAA studios are facing, is once the game comes out, it clearly wasn't ready because of corporate pressure, and then they have to invest even more money into making the game they actually promised. I'm going to talk about a few more of the issues associated with AAA game development here. Let me bring up this article here about moral disengagement in game development. Alright, so the author here opens up by noting some stories of financial and physiological harm caused by dark design and just the behavioral monetization in AAA games. Okay, so to explain what moral disengagement is, I'm going to use the Stanford Prison Experiment, which is mentioned in this article here. Essentially, what this experiment did is use ordinary people and illustrated the way that they can behave unethically when put in certain systems or roles. So this moral disengagement term helps us explain how game developers might participate in harmful game design without even feeling responsible for the consequences. There are some systemic industry factors here, such as the diffusion of responsibility. So big studios, oftentimes the decisions are made at way top, like just not even close to where the developers are actually doing things. But because they want to keep their jobs and everything, they just have to obey the authority. So whether they agree with the changes or they disagree with the changes, they have to comply with whatever is being said. And yeah, that goes a bit more into the studio culture and just power dynamics of an individual studio, I guess. So this article discusses some of that studio culture, including crunch, but also the discouragement from unionizing and speaking up about your beliefs, how they can suppress ethical pushback and keep people from actually challenging harmful practices. One of the ways they do that is by anonymizing and dehumanization. Developers are often anonymized behind corporate brands, making it much easier to distance themselves from the real players affected by their designs. Players themselves are often de-individualized, treated more as statistics and archetypes rather than real people or like consumers, which can further dull the empathy around the cultures here. You might have heard the term whale before. A whale is essentially a very high-spending consumer, or in this case, player. And that term just goes to show how language can even be used to dehumanize people and make exploitative decisions feel less morally significant. To be perfectly clear here, the author is not saying that game developers are evil people by any means. But what he is saying is that systemic pressures can entrench unethical practices. And without addressing the ethical implications and social concerns, exploitation and harmful systems in games can actually continue to worsen. So the big takeaway from this article is that moral disengagement mechanisms like obedience to authority, diffusion of responsibility, and anonymity can actually lead to otherwise decent developers participating in harmful or exploitive game design that they themselves don't want to be a part of. And because the industry is structured like this, it actually covers up the real impact of the design on the players, as well as developers maybe finding it easier to go along with these systems like behavioral monetization. The main thing is this piece urges awareness of those psychological and systemic forces to encourage more ethical choices in game development. But yeah, I guess my call to arms here is that this is not a talent problem by any means. This is a systemic failure. These developers are leaving because the system is literally killing them. And this is why they want to work at indie studios where they're not going to be treated like this. And they're trying to free themselves from the demoralizing, oppressive corporate culture surrounding game development. And if you guys want to take away anything from this video, please let it be the fact that developers are not disposable and creativity does not require suffering to make a good product. But yeah, with that said, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. It was a bit of a heavier one in some cases, but yeah, I think it was a necessary one to talk about. So yeah, you guys have a good rest of your weekend, and I'll see you in the next one. See ya.